The evening had been dressed in velvet civility, yet beneath it breathed the stench of desperation. Candles burned along the mantel of the drawing-room, their flames steady, as though even fire had learned restraint within these walls. The young woman stood before the hearth, gloved hands folded, her posture composed with the brittle grace of someone who had learned early that dignity was often the only possession poverty could not seize. She did not look at the papers laid upon the table, though she knew every word they contained, for she had heard them spoken aloud already, each clause pronounced with the chill precision of a sentence. Outside, carriage wheels whispered against the cobblestones, bearing witness to a transaction disguised as salvation. Her family sat arranged like spectators at a quiet execution. A mother dabbed at dry eyes, careful not to smear what little pride remained. An uncle cleared his throat with rehearsed solemnity. None spoke her name. Names, after all, were for those who were chosen, not sold. The contract required no tenderness. It promised shelter, title, and silence. In exchange, she was to surrender herself to a man she had never met, a duke known more by rumor than presence, whose estate sprawled vast and cold, whose temper was said to be as severe as the stone halls he ruled. He had not come. He would not come. His absence was deliberate, a signal to all assembled that this union required neither courtship nor consent, only compliance. She felt the weight of the room upon her spine. Every ticking second pressed against her ribs like a thumb testing fruit for weakness. When the solicitor slid the document forward, she did not flinch. She had learned that flinching invited cruelty. Instead, she lifted her chin, eyes fixed on a spot just above the man's shoulder, where a crack in the plaster resembled a bird in flight. She imagined escape in that shape, though she knew there would be none. Whispers already moved beyond these walls. They would say she had trapped him, that she had been eager, ambitious, ungrateful for the mercy bestowed upon her. They would not mention the debts, nor the letters stamped urgent and read, nor the winter that had hollowed the house until even the servants feared dismissal. Society preferred its lies tidy, its victims silent. There was, too, the unspoken knowledge that her value had been measured and found wanting until desperation altered the scale. Youth, once a promise, had become a bargaining chip. Her gentleness, once praised, was now merely convenient. She understood, with a clarity that stung, that this marriage was not meant to elevate her, but to erase a problem. The Duke required a wife without demands. Her family required relief without scandal. When the pen was placed in her hand, it trembled only once. The sound of ink scratching paper felt indecently loud. In that moment, something shifted, not in her circumstances, but within her. Fear, long her companion, withdrew to make room for a colder resolve. If this marriage was to be her cage, she would not rattle the bars. She would endure with such quiet fortitude that even her captors would grow uneasy. The solicitor pronounced the agreement complete. Chairs moved. Breath was released. The room exhaled, relieved that the unpleasantness had concluded. Yet for her, it had only begun. She was no longer merely a burden narrowly avoided. She was now a curiosity, a cautionary tale, a woman bound to a faceless title. The Duke's name hovered unspoken, as formidable as a storm cloud glimpsed on the horizon. Her mother rose at last and crossed the room, pressing a kiss to her cheek that lingered a fraction too long. "You will be safe," she whispered, the word trembling under the weight of doubt. Safety, the young woman knew, was not the same as kindness. It was merely survival dressed in gentler clothes. As the carriage was announced, she gathered her cloak and stepped toward the door. The hall beyond seemed to stretch endlessly, lined with portraits of ancestors who had married for land, for power, for alliances sealed without affection. She wondered how many of those painted women had stood as she did now, their hearts schooled into silence. The night air struck her face, sharp and awakening. The carriage lantern cast a pale glow upon the horse's flanks, steam rising like ghosts. A footman offered his hand, eyes lowered, as though even he felt the impropriety of touching what no longer belonged to itself. She climbed inside, the door closing with a finality that echoed in her chest. Inside the carriage, the upholstery smelled faintly of age and rain, a reminder that even conveyances carried histories of other departures. She clasped her hands together, feeling the pulse in her wrists, counting it as one might count steps while crossing thin ice. The city receded behind her, lamps blurring into a trembling ribbon of light. With each turn of the wheel, another certainty fell away. Childhood, expectation, even resentment loosened their hold, replaced by an austere calm. If she must be judged, she would be judged upright. If she must be endured, she would make endurance costly. In that resolve, fragile yet fierce, she discovered the first ember of herself she had not been asked to surrender. The road stretched ahead like a vow made without witnesses, long and irrevocable, carrying her toward a future shaped by another's name. She straightened, breathing once, preparing to meet whatever waited beyond the dark hedgerows and the cold promise of dawn. Alone. As the carriage lurched forward, she allowed herself one small breath of grief, released into the darkness where no one could witness it. She expected cruelty. She expected indifference sharpened into law. What she did not expect, what no one yet dared whisper, was that somewhere beyond the road's bend, a man waited who despised this arrangement as much as she did, and whose silence was not absence, but restraint. The Duke's estate revealed itself at dawn like a judgment rendered in stone. Iron gates parted without ceremony, admitting the carriage into a world measured by symmetry and silence. Frost clung to the gravel drive, crunching beneath the wheels as if the ground itself objected to her arrival. Towers rose against the pale sky, severe and unadorned, their windows dark, watchful. This was not a place built to welcome, it was built to endure. She stepped down with careful poise, her boots meeting the earth as though sealing a vow she had never spoken aloud. He did not come to greet her. Instead, stewards received her with impeccable restraint, their bows shallow, their expressions neutral. Her name was announced, followed immediately by his title, the weight of it filling the air between syllables. She was conducted through halls where portraits stared with ancestral disapproval, past tapestries depicting victories won by force rather than mercy. Each footstep echoed, reminding her that she was singular here, an addition not yet absorbed into the whole. When at last she was shown to her chambers, the door closed with a hush that felt less like privacy and more like assessment. Days unfolded with measured politeness. The Duke appeared only at prescribed hours, always impeccably attired, his manner cool, his gaze sharp yet distant. He spoke to her as one might address an equal in title, not a wife in intimacy. His voice carried no cruelty, but neither did it offer warmth. At table, conversation remained proper, confined to weather, estate matters, and social obligations. Yet she noticed the way his eyes flicked to her untouched plate, the slight tightening of his jaw when servants lingered too long. These were not gestures of indifference, but of vigilance carefully restrained. It was on the third morning that the first token appeared. She found it waiting upon a chair near the window, a shawl of fine wool, the color of winter roses, folded with deliberate care. No note accompanied it. She stood still for a long moment, fingers hovering above the fabric as though it might vanish if touched. When she finally draped it around her shoulders, warmth settled not only into her skin, but into something guarded deeper within. She did not ask who had sent it. She did not need to. The household observed. Servants exchanged glances, whispers threading through corridors like cautious smoke. At luncheon that day, the Duke remarked almost casually that the east wing would henceforth be closed to guests, as it caught the worst of the cold. His gaze met hers only once, briefly, yet the message was unmistakable. Protection, offered obliquely, as though naming it would diminish its power. Society, however, was less restrained. Invitations arrived bearing delicate script and sharper intentions. At her first public appearance beside him, murmurs followed their steps like a second train. She felt them appraise her gown, her posture, the modest incline of her head. They searched for ambition, for artifice, for proof that she had engineered this ascent. Instead, they found composure, and it unsettled them. When a matron remarked too loudly upon the speed of her good fortune, the Duke paused mid-step. His response was measured, his tone almost mild, yet the room seemed to draw inward around his words. He spoke of obligation, of duty fulfilled, of respect owed. The matron flushed, and silence fell like snow. That moment traveled faster than any carriage. By evening, it had become scandal. Some said he had been bewitched. Others whispered that he had always been dangerous, merely waiting for a cause. Letters arrived, advising caution, urging him to remember alliances. She read none of them, yet she felt their presence like pressure against the walls. With each defense he offered her, the cost mounted, and she began to fear the weight of his regard. More tokens followed, each quiet, each unmistakable. A book placed upon her desk, its margins marked where he had once lingered. A carriage drawn up precisely when rain darkened the sky. Her name, spoken correctly, gently, when others avoided it altogether. These gestures did not seek gratitude, they asked nothing, and thus unsettled her more than open demand ever could. Kindness, she had learned, was rarely without condition. At a winter gathering thick with candle smoke and expectation, the scandal sharpened. A gentleman, emboldened by wine and audience, implied that her presence had softened the Duke to foolishness. Laughter rippled, thin and cruel. Before she could retreat into silence, the Duke set down his glass. His voice carried, low but clear, slicing through the sound. He spoke not of love, nor of passion, but of honor. He reminded the room that mockery revealed more about the speaker than the subject. The laughter died, replaced by a brittle stillness that followed him long after he turned away. That night, she lay awake, shawl drawn close, listening to the wind trace the eaves. Gratitude warred with dread. She had expected cruelty and prepared herself for it. She had not prepared for this careful guardianship, this steady alignment of his power with her dignity. She wondered what it would cost him, and whether she could bear to be the reason. In the days that followed, distance grew not between them, but around them. Eyes watched more keenly. Conversations halted when they entered rooms. The Duke's silence deepened, his restraint taut as wire. She sensed a decision forming, unspoken yet inevitable. And one afternoon, as she passed a mirror in the long gallery, she caught sight not of a souled bride, but of a woman standing at the center of a gathering storm, sheltered only by the quiet resolve of a man whose protection had already begun to endanger them both. The storm arrived quietly, as if the world outside had waited for permission to grieve. Rain struck the tall windows with relentless rhythm, drumming against the panes like the distant warning of some unseen percussionist. Within the Duke's chambers, firelight flickered across high walls, casting long shadows that danced and recoiled in equal measure. The young woman stood near the window, shawl clutched about her shoulders, watching the garden vanish beneath a gray curtain of water. She could hear the wind's low moan, the rattle of iron hinges, the occasional crack of a branch against stone. Everything spoke of patience, of waiting, of a world suspended between fury and reprieve. He entered without knocking, a figure carved from restraint and shadow. His coat, dark as midnight in a cloudless sky, brushed the carpet softly. The room seemed to bend around him, the air thickening with unspoken weight. She did not turn immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the curtain of rain, as though it might offer clarity she could not summon herself. He stopped beside the hearth, his boots pausing just short of the rug's embroidered edge, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Finally he removed his gloves, folding them with deliberate care. The motion was ordinary, almost mundane, yet in it lay a precision that mirrored his mind, controlled, exacting, deliberate. She turned then, meeting his eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to see the man beneath the title, beneath the rumors, beneath the armor of propriety. There was weariness there, a depth of something both noble and wretched, like the calm of a winter sea just before the first wave breaks. "Why," she began softly, her voice nearly swallowed by the storm, "do you protect me so?" The words felt reckless, as though asking the question aloud might summon retribution. She had expected cruelty. She had trained herself for it, rehearsed the lines, the curtsies, the acquiescence required. She had not expected this measured vigilance that did not demand but insisted. He looked away, toward the flames, and in the way he spoke, she detected both confession and restraint. "Because it is the only thing I know to do," he said. The simplicity of the statement belied the complexity behind it. "Not out of kindness, not for gratitude, but because I have seen what indifference can destroy. And you," his voice faltered for a breath, enough to betray more than mere sentiment, "you deserve the certainty I cannot afford to give freely." She felt her chest tighten, the faint ache of recognition. Here was a man who had built walls not to trap others, but to safeguard what little he permitted himself to care for. The thought was dizzying. A life lived in calculation, And yet here, quietly, he had calculated her worth. Not for society, not for duty, but for something intimate, invisible, unspoken. "I thought," she whispered, stepping closer, "that I would find only coldness behind this title. That you would see me as an arrangement, a necessity, a burden." Her fingers tightened around the shawl. "I expected indifference, perhaps contempt, even hatred." He met her gaze fully now, the firelight reflecting in eyes that were dark, but not devoid of warmth. "I despise this arrangement," he said. The words were low, deliberate, almost dangerous. "I despised the notion of marriage as a transaction long before you arrived. And yet here I am, bound by duty, yet moved by something I refuse to name aloud." His jaw tightened, the muscles beneath the skin defined in subtle tension. "I am not indifferent, though I have spent years perfecting the art of seeming so." She listened, her heart a trembling thing. The revelation cut through years of expectation, carving a new understanding where fear had once resided. His confession was not a declaration of love, not yet, but it was a bridge, fragile and trembling, stretched over the gulf of silence that had separated them. In that moment, the distance that had always seemed insurmountable shortened, almost imperceptibly, as though a single spark might ignite the unseen air between them. "Then why remain?" she asked, voice barely audible above the wind. "If this marriage is a torment for us both, why endure it?" The question was reckless, yet necessary, a knife drawn against the veneer of civility. His gaze fell again to the fire, a flicker of sorrow dancing across features honed by discipline and pride. "Because retreat would betray more than myself," he replied. "It would betray the few truths I have allowed myself to protect. There are debts owed, not merely to my name, but to those who trusted it would uphold their expectations. To abandon you now would be to surrender a principle I have clung to, however flawed, however solitary." She inhaled sharply, understanding dawning. This man, feared and whispered about in every drawing-room, carried burdens that were not hers to share, yet he chose to shoulder them in her name. The realization brought no comfort, only a deepened awareness of the precariousness of her position, and the peculiar privilege of his attention. "You could hate me," she said, voice soft, nearly lost to the storm. "You could treat me as all expect you to." He shook his head slowly, a movement weighted with both regret and certainty. "And yet I do not. Not because I must, not because I am compelled, but because I recognize something in you I have rarely seen elsewhere. Fortitude, yes, but more than that, honesty. Even when it is inconvenient. Even when it costs me everything else." The words settled around her like snow on a darkened field, soft, impossible to resist, and yet cold with truth. She dared not respond immediately, for speech might shatter the delicate balance of confession, recognition, and restraint. She allowed herself only a glance, one measured, lingering enough to acknowledge that she had understood. That understanding, she realized, carried its own peril. A crack of thunder rolled through the night, rattling the windows and the thin glass of her certainty alike. He moved closer, closing the space between them with a gait deliberate and unhurried, the careful precision of a man who measured every step, every gesture. The distance that had defined their interaction, the formal courtesy, the polite restraint, fell away in increments no larger than a whisper. Yet it fell, inexorably, and with each inch, the air thickened with possibility. "You need not fear me," he said, his voice a murmur now, intimate in its timbre. "Not here, not in this place, not beneath these walls. I will not permit it." The declaration was not grandiose. It bore no flourish, no dramatic pretense. It was simple, resolute, and terrifying in its quiet certainty. She understood then that the battle between expectation and reality had begun in earnest. He had offered her a measure of safety, not in compliance, not in submission, but in acknowledgment. And acknowledgment, she realized, was a far more dangerous thing than indifference. It demanded a response, a negotiation of the soul itself. She remained silent for a long moment, eyes tracing the flames that quivered and shivered against the high mantle. Somewhere deep within, a spark had taken hold, not of desire, not yet of love, but of something equally potent, the fragile, terrifying hope that this man, feared and distant, might one day see her not as a burden, but as a choice. A knock echoed suddenly at the chamber door, abrupt and intrusive, slicing through the intimacy they had built in silence. His head tilted slightly, a subtle warning, a pause pregnant with implication. She turned toward the sound, pulse quickened, the shadows of uncertainty stretching across the firelit walls. And in that suspended moment, with storm and shadow and confession hanging heavy, the realization struck both of them. The world outside these walls would not allow their truths to remain secret for long. Someone had listened. Someone had heard enough. And now, the delicate balance of protection, revelation, and restraint teetered on the edge of exposure, threatening to undo everything they had begun to understand about each other. The grand hall of the Duke's estate shimmered beneath a canopy of crystal chandeliers, their prisms scattering pale gold light across faces both eager and scrutinizing. Winter had softened into early spring, but the air within was heavy, thick with the perfume of polished wood, candles, and whispered expectation. Guests had gathered in their finery, silks and velvets, lace and polished shoes, a congregation of society's arbiters, each ready to measure the young Duchess by the unspoken rules of propriety and rumor. She moved among them with careful poise, her gown of muted sapphire reflecting the firelight, every step a practiced ballet of restraint. Yet beneath her composure, her pulse raced, attuned to the storm of judgment surrounding her. He appeared as he always did, composed, formidable, a study in controlled gravity. The room seemed to bend subtly around him, the murmurs tapering to a hush as his gaze swept across the assembly. She felt it as though the air had thickened, heavy with anticipation and the unspoken question. What would the Duke do? What measure of scandal would he tolerate? And more urgently, what would he risk to protect the fragile dignity she had clung to since arrival? The first note of tension arrived in the guise of an accusation. A viscount, emboldened by wine and the certainty of anonymity within the crowd, approached under the guise of conversation. His words, veiled as concern, carried insinuation, that the Duchess had overstepped her bounds, that her presence softened the Duke to dangerous folly, that she imperiled alliances carefully cultivated over decades. Laughter rippled, sharp and brittle, like glass cracking beneath weight, and for a heartbeat, the young woman felt the old familiar clutch of fear, the fear of being measured, dismissed, and found wanting. He moved then, deliberate, silent, a shadow before the fire. When he spoke, it was with that same measured authority that had drawn her attention from the beginning. His tone carried no anger, yet every word cut through the murmurs like a finely tempered blade. "It is not for others to dictate my regard," he said, eyes fixed calmly on the man who had dared insult her. "Nor shall the whispers of folly dictate the respect owed to those who stand with integrity." There was no flourish, no grandiose display of temper. Yet in the precise weight of his diction, in the unyielding posture, the room understood that opposition would come at a cost. The Viscount's color shifted, his voice faltering, and the assembly inhaled collectively, suspended in the tension of observation. The Duchess's chest heaved beneath her bodice, a quiet tremor of relief and disbelief. The first wave had passed, yet she knew the storm was far from spent. Every gesture, every public declaration, carried consequence, and the Duke's defense had both shielded and exposed her. She was a protected figure, yes, but one whose presence now posed questions too dangerous to ignore. As the evening deepened, the Duke's attention, previously veiled in courteous distance, became unmistakable. He was present in subtle gestures, a hand lightly resting near hers as she navigated the crowded ballroom, a soft word of instruction to a servant to anticipate her needs, eyes that lingered just long enough to convey vigilance without intrusion. Each act, each token, threaded a narrative that defied society's expectation and rewrote the rules of propriety. She realized that what she had once accepted as a cage, a union without warmth, had begun to shift, imperceptibly, into a framework of protection and regard, dangerous and intoxicating in its intensity. Yet it was not enough for mere tokens and whispered gestures. The crisis, inevitable and necessary, came in the form of a formal proposition, a subtle but unmistakable pressure from the Duke's peers and family, urging him to repudiate the union quietly. Letters and veiled threats pressed against the walls of his estate, demanding compliance with tradition, alliances, and self-preservation. The Duchess watched him receive these missives with that same unflinching poise that had both unsettled and captivated her from the start. His eyes betrayed only a flicker of the burden such pressure carried, yet she saw, in that slight moment, the gravity of what it would cost him to protect her openly. The defining moment arrived at the peak of the evening, in a corridor adjoining the great hall. The crowd, now gathered at a distance, held its collective breath, uncertain if the Duke would submit to convention or assert the principle he had long guarded. He took her hand then, a gesture both public and intimate, and led her to the center of the assembled company. Every eye turned, the chandeliers casting prismatic light across their figures, illuminating the contrast between expectation and reality. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, unwavering, and magnetic. "Let all who gather witness that my choice is deliberate and unalterable. She stands beside me not as a convenience, not as a transaction, but as the woman I have chosen to honor, to protect, and to hold above every consideration of title, fortune, or reputation." The words fell like a gavel, absolute, leaving no room for misinterpretation. There was no flourish, no grandiose gesture of emotion, only the unyielding assertion of agency and devotion. A hush followed, reverent and tentative. Some faces flushed with indignation, others with surprise, all with curiosity sharpened to a point. The Duchess felt the air shift around her, the weight of every expectation she had feared, every insult endured, every whispered doubt, being lifted and transformed by the simplicity of truth. She met his eyes, finding not triumph, but steadfastness, a promise beyond words, a covenant made in defiance of a world unwilling to bend. The Viscount, now pale and defeated, attempted a retort, but no words formed. The authority of the Duke's declaration had sealed the moment. Even those most committed to convention understood, at last, that some principles, love, respect, protection, were immutable, and that the courage to uphold them carried consequences society was unprepared to impose. As the evening waned, the Duchess experienced a revelation both thrilling and frightening. She was no longer a passive participant in the world around her. She was a chosen presence, a focus of intent and protection. And yet, with this honor came a burden, the recognition that the gaze of society, sharpened by curiosity and envy, would not relent, and that each subsequent gesture of intimacy or protection would be scrutinized and measured against expectation. The freedom implicit in being chosen was inseparable from the vigilance it demanded. When the crowd dispersed, leaving the hall heavy with candlelight and the lingering scent of perfume and wax, they found themselves alone for the first time that night. The Duke released her hand, but the weight of his regard did not diminish. He did not approach for praise, nor solicit gratitude. Instead, he regarded her quietly, as if measuring not her reaction, but the truth of her presence, the depth of her understanding, the courage she would need to meet the trials still to come. "You understand," he said softly, almost in passing, "that this is only the beginning." His tone carried neither warning nor menace, only the acknowledgment of a world that would not yield easily. She nodded, comprehension settling deep in her chest, the thrill of being recognized and chosen colliding with the fear of exposure and consequence. For the first time, she saw that their union was not simply an arrangement to be endured. It was a bond forged in quiet defiance, one that would demand courage, patience, and resolve from both of them. Outside, the night continued, indifferent to declarations and promises. Rain had ceased, leaving the garden slick and gleaming, lanterns casting trembling reflections across wet stone. Within the hall, the glow of candlelight offered warmth, but also revealed the distance yet to be traversed, the whispers still waiting in shadow, the society still poised to test the bounds of their resolve. In that charged silence, the Duchess understood the truth she had long suspected. Love, when claimed in defiance of expectation, was never simple. It was a landscape of risk, of courage, of intimate peril, and it was hers, finally, to inhabit. A subtle knock at the door interrupted the stillness, a gentle yet deliberate signal. Both turned, instinctively alert. The sound carried weight, promising news, disruption, or perhaps revelation. They exchanged a glance, steady, unflinching, bound by shared understanding. The world beyond the door awaited, but inside, a fragile victory had been claimed, and with it, the first measure of triumph in a life long overshadowed by circumstance. The morning broke with the quiet authority of inevitability, sunlight spilling across the frost-dusted lawns of the Duke's estate, gilding every stone and shuttered window with a pale gold that seemed almost sacred. The young Duchess stood near the drawing-room window, her hands lightly folded, fingers tracing the lace at her wrist. She breathed deeply, the scent of polished wood, early bloom, and lingering candle smoke filling her senses, grounding her in a moment that had been long anticipated, long feared, yet not fully imagined until now. The events of the previous evening had shifted the balance of power, of perception, of choice. The world had seen her defended, chosen, elevated above the murmurs of society, yet with recognition came exposure, a weight she could not ignore. The Duke entered, as he always did, silent, measured, the very embodiment of restraint and purpose. His coat brushed the floor lightly, boots carrying no sound upon the carpet, his gaze fixed upon her with a precision that seemed both protective and piercing. She felt the familiar stir of apprehension, tempered now with an ember of anticipation. The night's declaration had been public. This moment, intimate, carried the raw possibility of consequence without witness. He closed the door gently behind him, cutting off the hall's whispers, and for the first time that morning, the space felt wholly theirs. "You know," he began, voice low, steady, "that the world does not forgive ease of conscience. They will not yield to reason or respect. They will test us, push, and measure until the strength we possess collapses or bends." He paused, studying her with careful attention, as if weighing the courage he had observed against the vulnerability he now discerned. "Do you understand the gravity of being chosen, not merely defended?" She met his eyes, feeling the unspoken weight of his question. Her reflection in the window, pale and composed, seemed to hold a hint of the resolve that had been slowly forged within her these months. "I understand," she whispered, "and I am prepared, though it is not without fear." Fear was familiar, a constant companion. It was the willingness to act despite it that marked courage, and she now felt that courage pulsed through her veins. The storm of society had not ceased. Letters arrived with gentle insistence, servants whispered of conversations overheard, alliances teetered under pressure. Every step, every gesture required careful navigation, yet each challenge also illuminated the unanticipated freedom of her position. She had been sold into a marriage expecting only confinement. She had found a partnership rooted in choice, however precarious, however invisible to the untrained eye. The Duke's hand, when it reached for hers, was both signal and covenant. He did not demand affection, nor did he solicit admiration. He offered it silently, deliberately, a promise rendered in the simplest of gestures. She allowed her fingers to close lightly over his, the touch electric in its restraint, a communion of mutual understanding. "Whatever comes," he murmured, "we face it together. Not as property, not as title, but as allies bound by more than circumstance." The first test arrived that afternoon, sudden and unanticipated. A messenger, breathless, bearing a letter sealed with urgency, delivered word that a creditor of the Duke's distant estates threatened scandal should funds remain unsettled. The potential for public embarrassment, for misrepresentation, loomed immediately. Yet the Duke did not falter. He read the missive, his expression unchanging, then folded it with care, placing it aside. "Let them watch," he said, voice quiet yet laced with authority. "They will see how we endure what they presume insurmountable. Our integrity need not bend to their expectations." She observed him, heart fluttering with awe and trepidation. This was a man who had mastered the art of restraint, whose life had been ruled by duty and fear of folly, now choosing to wield both for the protection of another. The realization was dizzying. She was no longer a passive participant, no longer a figure to be managed or endured. She was chosen, defended, and yet not sheltered from the demands of consequence. The partnership they shared was neither simple nor easy. It was a deliberate, perilous negotiation of courage, devotion, and will. The afternoon waned into evening, and with it came the gathering that had long promised the highest scrutiny. The grand hall filled once more, chandeliers casting prismatic light across silk and lace, polished boots and gloved hands. Conversations hushed as they entered, not out of deference, but in recognition of the bond silently declared, publicly confirmed the night prior. Eyes lingered, some with curiosity, others with envy or resentment, but all were forced to acknowledge the singular presence of the Duchess and the Duke beside her. He guided her to the center of the hall, hands gentle yet deliberate, a stance that required no proclamation to convey strength. When he spoke, the room fell silent as if holding breath itself. "This union," he said, voice low and precise, "is not the result of obligation alone, nor of fortune, nor of convenience. It is forged in choice, deliberate and unwavering, and it shall not be questioned nor diminished by rumor, conjecture, or threat. A tremor passed through the assembly, some flushed with indignation, others with disbelief, and the silence itself seemed to carry weight, tangible as the crystal chandeliers above. The Duchess, standing beside him, felt the full impact of his declaration, not as triumph over others, but as affirmation of the reality they had carved together. She was no longer merely defended. She was chosen, acknowledged, and honored in the face of all scrutiny. Night deepened, the estate quiet beyond the last of departing guests. They found themselves alone in the drawing-room, the air saturated with candle smoke, firelight, and the lingering tension of the day. He released her hand, not in withdrawal, but with the unspoken promise that presence was not measured by touch alone. She turned to him, heart thrumming with a mixture of exhilaration and fear, recognizing that victory, while sweet, was not without its burdens. "You have endured," he said softly, almost as if reading the unspoken thoughts that trembled across her features. "And yet the trials will continue, as society does not forgive choice, nor courage, nor defiance of expectation. You must know this, even as you embrace what we have begun together." She nodded, understanding more fully than ever the price of being chosen, of standing beside a man who dared defy the world in the name of principle and protection. And in that acknowledgment, a quiet shift occurred, subtle yet profound. She realized that the life she had imagined as confinement had become a landscape of possibility, shaped by courage, mutual regard, and deliberate defiance. The fire crackled, casting light upon their faces, highlighting the subtle strength and careful vulnerability in each expression. He stepped closer, finally bridging the distance that had always marked their interactions. "Whatever awaits," he murmured, "whatever challenges society may yet place before us, we shall meet them as we have met this one, together, unflinching, chosen, and unashamed." The Duchess felt a tremor of relief and triumph, tempered by awareness of the vigilance still demanded. She allowed herself a faint, steadying smile, and in that moment, a sense of home and belonging settled over her, unbidden yet undeniable. The storm of whispers, the threat of scandal, the weight of expectation, all existed beyond the threshold, and yet, within the walls of this room, they had carved a sanctuary neither could take from them. A soft knock at the chamber door interrupted the quiet, deliberate in its persistence. Both turned, instinctively alert, a reminder that the world beyond would always test the boundaries of choice and courage. He exchanged a glance with her, steady, resolute, their mutual understanding unspoken but absolute. The door had arrived as both signal and challenge, promise and unknown, a reminder that the trials of society would continue, that their bond would require vigilance and care, yet also confirming, without doubt, that they were prepared to face it together. Outside, the first light of dawn glimmered upon wet stone and dew-laden hedges, casting long shadows into the hall. Inside, the Duchess and the Duke stood poised at the center of a life reclaimed, a victory achieved not by circumstance but by deliberate choice, by courage, and by the intimate, defiant acknowledgement of one another. And as they turned toward the door, ready to confront the next trial together, the promise remained unbroken, that love, once chosen and defended, could endure even the most relentless scrutiny, and in its quiet, steadfast assertion reshape every expectation, every judgment, every whispered doubt.